What do we really care about in education? Because here's the thing. What we really care about, we usually deliberately target. We care about literacy, so we deliberately teach letter sounds before blends, blends before sentences in a sequence we've mapped out year by year. We also care about math, right? So we sequence number sense before fractions, fractions before algebra. Nothing about this is left to chance. So what about creativity? If we say we care about it, are we targeting it with that same deliberateness? Just think about that for a moment. Let me tell you about a time where I was so focused heavily on teaching content that I assumed that creativity would simply follow. I was hired to build a brand new digital media and movie making program for 10 high schools across Connecticut. Now, the goal was simple, straightforward: teach students real production skills. The first challenge I gave each school was wide open. Make a 1-minute public service announcement on that year's theme, green. Now that's it, just green. It was the shared theme that year across every program at the Center for 21st Century Skills, which is where I worked at the time. We wanted students in all our STEM-based programs thinking about the environment, but we didn't want to create a situation where we push them too hard in one direction. Now, a few months later, we invited the 10 schools that piloted the digital media and movie making program that year to a university to screen their films for the first time. I remember I loaded them onto my laptop, dimmed the lights. I was a little bit nervous because some funders were in the room, and then I pressed play. First film, recycling. Second film, recycling. Third film, also recycling. By the end of the day, 7 of the 9 films shown that day were about recycling. Now, while there were certainly some positives to take from the event, particularly around the teaching of the film production skills, which was obviously a main objective, some of our funders, including my boss, raised some concerns about the lack of originality in the storyline. And that was the question I had to sit with after that experience. How does an open-ended challenge end up producing almost the same idea 7 times over? Now, at first, I wondered if it was associated with the examples that I had shared through the curriculum. But after a quick review, I realized there weren't really too many examples that overemphasized recycling. So I decided to engage with some of the schools, kind of like a mini intervention, to better understand how they went about their ideas. And it was through this one particular conversation with the teacher that I suddenly gathered the information I needed. Because he said that he felt like the theme was too restrictive, or rather the students did. Now, I remember pausing. What was restrictive about the color green? But I continued to think about this as I drove back from the school that day. And I suddenly came to the conclusion that the problem wasn't the students or the teachers, and it wasn't the school, and it certainly wasn't the theme green. Instead, it was an assumption that I had made when designing the experience. I had assumed that once presented with an open-ended assignment, students and teachers would engage creativity in their choice of topic to find new possibilities around the theme green, which would include the pursuit of novelty and originality in their thinking. But this was wrong. Unless there is scaffolding that supports originality, including enough exposure to other ideas and ways of thinking, open-ended assignments like this one won't automatically mean students produce more original ideas. So that is why I now deliberately target original thinking when designing any open-ended assignment. And with that, I deliberately integrate different strategies to achieve that goal. Welcome to episode 1 of our Listen and Learn series, which provide us with the first of our 10 actions for fueling creativity in education. Be deliberate. So what do we mean when we say be deliberate? A significant aspect of teaching is designing learning experiences with the deliberate intention to teach and target the learning of specific content, skills, and therefore objectives. When teaching young children reading and writing, for example, we target the learning of letter sounds. By a certain age, we want children to know the letters of the alphabet and know the sounds they make. Then later, we introduce them to things like digraphs and how 2 letters combined can make a different sound. As teachers, we are also responsible for designing these experiences to teach these skills. Some of us may choose to utilize mobile apps, for example, interactive whiteboards, letter games, group work, and realistically, most of the time, I suspect we accommodate all of the above. The attention that we place on these skills are high because without them, we know that most children, as they get older, will struggle to read and write without them. and as a consequence, not having the education needed to produce and consume and interact with text-based information. Now, from our conversations with teachers and researchers, it is clear that while teaching and learning standards across the grades, many educators who've come on the show, when designing learning experiences, also deliberately target the teaching of creativity or creative thinking skills. And this is why our 10 actions for fueling creativity in education begin with be deliberate. So I ask you to reflect for a moment. To what extent do you deliberately target the teaching of creativity in your classroom? I'm just curious. Talking about giving students open projects, for example, that's great, because I will tell you that it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that students will develop or apply more creativity to the learning task. Because the teaching of creativity can look and sound very different depending on the subject or context or, of course, the constraints that you're working with. And that is why it's up to you as the educator to design specific strategies that you can use to promote creativity in the classroom. So here's something to sit with this week. Not an assignment, just a couple of reflective questions. That's what I'm going to be doing throughout this series. Of all the things that you say you care about in your classroom, which ones are you actually designing for? And which ones are you just hoping will show up on their own? We get that learning standards should be there. They absolutely should. But those standards don't have to be the only thing we target in our lessons. And if creativity is in that second group, that's not a failure. It's just worth noticing. And guess what? You don't even have to fix it this week or next week, because noticing it is where being deliberate actually starts. Because it does set up our second question, which is, what opportunities in your classroom already exist for promoting creativity? Maybe it's a morning routine that can include a question or short activity to spark a little curiosity, but before it, you might have to facilitate how we answer questions. Maybe it's a closing question at the end of the lesson to connect the learner to something new, or maybe there's a project that just with a few minor tweaks, which might just be give more time for ideation, could better target the development of new and useful ideas. You don't need to find all of them. One is enough for the upcoming semester. And as many of our guests have emphasized, and really emphasized, it's good to start small. In this chapter of our book, we provide a lot more information about being deliberate and its close relationship with instructional design. But we also include some more stories from educators from the podcast who gravitate towards specific teaching and learning styles because they see this as an effective way to fuel creativity in education. In many ways, being deliberate is ultimately why we started our podcast, because we wanted the teaching of creativity to be at the forefront of a classroom. And being deliberate is also why we wrote a book that offers 10 actions that support creativity. Because when we are deliberate, we are more likely to succeed in our effort to promote and facilitate what we see as a critical competency, particularly in the world of AI, for our future creatives.